Every night, plantation owners locked their doors. Iron bolts slid into place. Windows were secured. Guards took their positions. And every night, one man still walked inside. By morning, they would find signs, never dramatic, never violent. A chair turned slightly. A candle snuffed out too cleanly. A book opened to a page no one remembered reading. Nothing stolen, nothing broken, just proof. Proof that someone had been there. This wasn't superstition. It wasn't a ghost story whispered to scare children. It was a pattern repeated across plantations, quietly discussed among owners who rarely admitted fear. They called him nothing out loud. But among themselves, they understood exactly what he represented. A failure of control. Plantations were built on certainty. Owners believed they knew where everyone slept, worked, and moved. Every enslaved person had a place, a purpose, a limit. Doors existed to reinforce that belief. And yet this man crossed those boundaries without resistance. No one ever saw him enter. No one ever caught him leaving. But everyone knew when he had come. What disturbed them wasn't the intrusion, it was the intention. He didn't steal silver, he didn't attack, he didn't sabotage property, he observed. And observation was dangerous. Because the moment an enslaved person could move freely inside a master's home, the entire hierarchy collapsed. The walls meant nothing. The locks meant nothing. Authority became theater. Rumors spread quietly through the enslaved quarters. Not loudly, loudly got you punished. These were careful whispers, exchanged while working, while cleaning, while serving meals. He's already been inside. They can't stop him. He sees what they hide. Hope didn't explode, it simmered. Plantation owners responded the only way they knew how, denial in public, paranoia in private. Guards were doubled, dogs were trained, rules tightened, yet nothing changed. The signs kept appearing. And that was when fear truly set in. Because the more defenses they added, the clearer it became. This man wasn't powerful because he was strong. He was powerful because he was invisible. And invisibility, once achieved, is almost impossible to take back. By the end of that season, plantation owners were no longer asking if the stories were true. They were asking a far more dangerous question. How does a slave walk anywhere he wants? And why hasn't he been stopped? Locked doors gave plantation owners comfort. They believed iron and wood were enough to separate power from submission. They were wrong. Because this man didn't defeat locks with force. He defeated them with understanding. Plantations ran on routine. The same meals at the same hours. The same guards on the same paths. The same doors locked by the same hands every night. What owners called security was really just repetition. And repetition creates patterns. This man watched those patterns for years. While serving food, he noticed which doors were locked first and which were locked last. While cleaning rooms, he learned which windows stuck and which hinges creaked. While standing silently in corners, he memorized footsteps, breathing, and habits. Most importantly, he learned people. He knew which guard drank before night duty and fell asleep early. He knew which overseer trusted the sound of his own keys more than the feel of the lock. He knew which owners believed fear alone was enough protection. Keys were not sacred objects. They were tools passed carelessly from hand to hand, sometimes left on tables, sometimes dropped, sometimes copied in ways owners never imagined possible. And sometimes they weren't needed at all. Many doors were locked out of habit, not urgency. A half-turned bolt, a latch assumed secure, a window believed unreachable. He didn't rush, he waited for certainty. But here's the part that truly unsettled them. Entering the houses wasn't the point. Letting them know he had entered was. He never left chaos behind. Chaos could be blamed on servants, animals, or accidents. Instead, he left precision, intentionality, just enough disturbance to communicate presence without revealing method. A letter returned to its place, but folded differently. A weapon shifted slightly out of reach. A candle placed upright, untouched beside a sleeping owner. These weren't mistakes, they were messages. I was here. You didn't know. And you still don't. Owners searched for hidden tunnels, conspiracies, outside help. They suspected rebellion, foreign influence, sabotage. None of it fit. because the truth was simpler and more humiliating. The system itself made him invisible. They never questioned the people who moved through their homes every day. They never imagined that observation could be weaponized. They never considered that silence was a form of intelligence. This man didn't break into houses. He walked through the blind spots power creates when it assumes obedience. And once plantation owners realized that, once they understood that every locked door was only as strong as the person who believed in it, fear stopped being loud. It became quiet, measured, constant, because now they knew something worse than intrusion was happening. Someone was watching. Plantation owners liked to believe fear ran in one direction. From them downward. They controlled land, bodies, and punishment. Violence was visible, measurable, and familiar. They knew how to use it. They understood it. What they did not understand and could not control was knowledge. This man didn't enter houses to steal valuables. He entered to listen, observe, and remember. At night, power relaxed. Conversations became careless. Secrets surfaced. He learned which owners were drowning in debt, which families were fighting behind closed doors, which overseers skimmed supplies and lied about inventory, which punishments were exaggerated and which atrocities were hidden. And once knowledge exists, it spreads. Not openly, not recklessly. It moved the way survival always does, quietly, selectively, person to person. The enslaved community didn't need speeches or declarations. They only needed confirmation. The master is weak. The overseer lies. They're afraid too. That understanding alone shifted behavior. Orders were questioned silently. Punishments were anticipated. Resistance became calculated instead of emotional. Plantation owners noticed changes but couldn't explain them. Work slowed just enough. Eyes met just long enough. Compliance became performance. The most dangerous part wasn't that this man knew secrets. It was that owners never knew which secrets he knew. A guard hesitated before striking. An overseer softened his tone. An owner avoided certain rooms at night. Fear had reversed direction. Plantation owners could survive open rebellion. Rebellion justified brutality. It reinforced their narrative of control. But this uncertainty, dissolved authority from the inside. To admit what was happening would mean admitting a truth they could not afford. That enslaved people were watching. That enslaved people understood. That enslaved people were capable of restraint, strategy, and patience. So instead, they denied it. Publicly, they dismissed the stories as exaggeration. Privately, they whispered names, watched shadows, and slept lightly. Guards were increased not to catch him, but to reassure themselves. Nothing worked, because the threat was no longer one man. It was awareness, and awareness cannot be whipped out of existence. Eventually, plantation owners reached the same unspoken conclusion. This could not continue, not because of immediate danger, but because of what it represented. If one enslaved man could move unseen, gather knowledge, and change behavior without violence, then the entire system rested on a lie. And lies collapse when too many people stop believing them. That's when they decided to act. Quietly, decisively, without leaving records. But power always makes mistakes. And the night they tried to end this story became the night everything went wrong. Every system tolerates disruption until it feels exposed. For a long time, plantation owners endured uncertainty because they couldn't prove anything. Fear without evidence is uncomfortable, but manageable. What they could not tolerate was the possibility that others were beginning to understand what they already suspected. That night something changed. No one knows exactly what he did differently. The records are silent and the whispers contradict each other. But all versions agree on one point: he stayed longer than he ever had before. Maybe he lingered to listen. Maybe he underestimated exhaustion. Maybe someone finally noticed a pattern they had ignored for years. Whatever the reason, guards were waiting. Not everywhere, just enough. They didn't catch him in the open. That would have required admitting too much. Instead, they tightened routines, watched doorways more carefully, and followed suspicion rather than proof. By morning, the plantation felt different. People were questioned without explanation. Work was delayed. Overseers hovered instead of barked orders. The air carried that specific tension that only comes before punishment. Someone was being hunted. But here's what frustrated them: no one confessed. No witnesses came forward. No evidence appeared. They knew what had happened, but they couldn't say it out loud. Because saying it would mean admitting that for years, an enslaved man had walked freely through their private spaces. That was unacceptable. So the response became indirect. Punishments increased, not tied to crimes. Restrictions tightened without justification. Public warnings were delivered broadly, so no single person could be identified as the target. Fear was reintroduced deliberately. Yet it didn't work the way they expected. The man didn't reappear, but neither did the certainty they wanted. The signs stopped, but the damage remained. Owners slept knowing that their defenses had once failed completely. And worse, others had seen that failure. Among the enslaved, the lesson was clear. Someone had pushed too far and power had reacted, but power hadn't won cleanly. There was no triumph, no public capture, no body displayed as a warning. Only silence. That silence became dangerous in its own way. Because when a system erases something instead of confronting it, it teaches people that truth exists beyond permission. It confirms that something real happened, something frightening enough to be buried. Plantation owners tried to restore order by pretending nothing had changed. But they couldn't undo what had already been learned. That control was not absolute. That authority relied on belief. That fear could be reversed. The man himself faded from view after that night. Whether he was moved, silenced, or forced into stillness is unknown. What matters is this: the system survived, but it survived injured. And injuries leave marks, even when history refuses to name them. History is not a neutral record. It is a selection. What gets preserved is what power finds useful. What threatens that power is minimized, distorted, or erased. This man's story didn't disappear by accident, it was deliberately smothered. Because it proved something plantation owners never wanted future generations to understand. Control was never complete. There were no official names attached to him, no court records, no public punishment. That absence is not coincidence. Recording his story would have required admitting that enslaved people could observe, plan, and undermine authority without violence. That was more dangerous than rebellion. Rebellions could be crushed and documented as justification for brutality. This could not. It exposed fragility instead of strength. So the system did what systems always do when exposed. It removed the evidence. Stories survived only where power couldn't reach, in fragments, in warnings passed quietly between generations, in lessons disguised as folklore, not to glorify him but to remind people of what was possible. He didn't free anyone by force. He didn't overthrow a plantation, and that's precisely why his story mattered. He demonstrated that freedom begins before chains are broken. He showed that understanding a system allows you to move through it without permission. That observing power closely reveals its dependence on habit, not invincibility. Plantation owners wanted obedience rooted in fear. What he introduced was something far more destabilizing: awareness. Once people saw that doors could be crossed, even invisibly, they never fully believed in locks again. That belief outlived him. Long after his name was lost, the lesson remained. Watch carefully, move patiently, and never confuse silence with ignorance. Power collapses when those beneath it understand how it actually works. This is why history didn't record him. Not because he was insignificant, but because he was effective. He represented the kind of resistance that can't be punished publicly without exposing weakness. The kind that forces systems to pretend nothing happened while quietly adjusting their behavior. And that is the most honest proof that he existed. Because if nothing had changed, there would have been no reason to hide him. Yet the fear lingered, the routines tightened, the denial hardened. All because one man walked through locked doors and showed that freedom doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it enters quietly at night and leaves before anyone can stop it. That's the story they tried to bury. and the reason it still refuses to stay there.